This is the Protestant Libertarian Podcast, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute and part of the Christians for Liberty Network. I really hope that you guys enjoy today's show. All right, guys, welcome to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. My guest today is Dr. Chris Keith. Dr. Keith is Research Professor of New Testament and Early Christianity at MF Norwegian School of Theology, Religion, and Society. He is the author of several excellent books, including Jesus Against the Scribal Elites, and is the editor of The Next Quest for the Historical Jesus, out now on Eerdmans. He contributes a chapter to the book entitled Beyond What Is Behind, where he argues that the next quest should abandon the attempt to get behind the text, the historical Jesus, and instead examine what the sources and the wider social context of Jesus might tell us about the impact that he had on those that followed him. We will be discussing this chapter on the show today. Dr. Keith, welcome to the Protestant Libertarian Podcast.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate the invitation.
I'm really excited to talk to you today. I think that you are the fifth contributor to the Next Quest book that I've interviewed so far, and you are also one of the general editors. So I'm excited to get your take on all of that and, of course, your contribution to the book. But before we get into that, just introduce yourself to my audience. Tell us about your background, your work, what you'd like to do, all those kind of things.
Right, thank you very much. My background, I am, you can probably tell, most of my more recent career has been in the UK, and now my official post is in Norway, but you can probably tell I have neither a British nor Norwegian accent. I was born and raised in Kentucky. I live there now. I've lived in many places, did my PhD in Edinburgh. My first post was at a small school in Illinois, in central Illinois. Then my family and I were in London for 3 years, and then we moved back to the U.S. And I think for the final 7 years that I was at St. Mary's, I went back and forth, and now at MF. What do I have a beautiful, wonderful wife and 4 kids who are crazy and fantastic, and they keep me very, very busy. My oldest is 16, and then I have a 13-year-old, and then I have a 9-year-old and a 7-year-old who's about to turn 8 in a couple months. So we have a wide range, and I haven't slept in a decade, but getting ready to start basketball seasons for the youngest 2, and I coach them. I played basketball in high school and then college, so I look forward to coaching them. I have a blast at it. Personally, I like to run a lot. I run a lot of half marathons and marathons, and do CrossFit too. But right now, I just started training for the Boston Marathon, so that's the biggest. I qualified and will be running in April, and that's the biggest side interest that I have going right now.
Yeah, that's incredible, man. Again, being able to produce all of this scholarly work and also have 4 kids on top of that, I have a ton of respect for you for being able to do that. I am curious. I'm from Kentucky, too. I'm in Independence in northern Kentucky. What part of the state are you in right now?
I'm in Louisville.
Okay. All right. Yeah, you're just down the road from us.
Yep. And I was in college in Cincinnati, so right across the road from you.
Wait, did you go to Cincinnati Christian University?
I did indeed, yeah.
Oh, so did I. What year did you graduate?
I graduated my undergrad in 2002, and then my MDiv in 2005.
Okay, so I didn't start until 2007, so we just missed each other. But yeah, man, CCU grad. It's a shame what happened to that school.
It is in some ways it's astounding that it didn't happen in the 80s or the 90s. Yeah. It had been existing on the knife edge, the financial knife edge, for a long time. So I'm not entirely shocked, but sorry that it happened. I had a lot of good friends who were affected, and of course, lots of us, out in the diaspora with CCU degrees that they're like, "Where is that?" It's like it's not anywhere now. But yeah, and I played basketball there.
Oh, that's awesome, man. Hey, well, that's great. Well, we have a lot of great connections here. That's cool. All right. Well, I guess you are one of the editors of The Next Quest for the Historical Jesus, and you've been reading and writing and doing a lot of scholarship for a long time here. What drew you to this project? And then what do you hope that The Next Quest is going to accomplish?
James Crossley drew me to the project. I really thought that after I wrote Jesus Against the Scribal Elite, and then did the reception of Jesus in the first 3 centuries, which was a big 3-volume reception history of Jesus with T&T Clark that I served as the main editor for. It had I can't remember how many chapters. It's 3 volumes. I think it was 850,000 words. I really thought I'd kind of said everything I wanted to say about Jesus, about the historical Jesus. And then I was under contract with Yale University Press to write a book on the Gospel of John and the historical Jesus. And so my attention had somewhat turned back to it, but really James Crossley, who was part of the Center for the Study of Judaism, Christianity, and Antiquity that I directed at St. Mary's at the time, he and I were having a lot of discussions about mutual frustrations with kind of the state of Jesus studies. We both had made various contributions and were getting asked a lot of questions about where everything goes from here. And James kind of got really agitated, and, in text messages on WhatsApp was, we would go back and forth a lot on what could be done, this, that, and the other. And we finally just dreamed this project up and realized we were kind of in position to do it. Again, this may or may not answer your question, but after Anthony LaDon and I did the Jesus Criterion, the Demise of Authenticity, that brought the criteria approach into sharp criticism, and which is what we intended it to do. And by and large, I think was fairly effective in doing what, there were, of course, detractors, there were critics, but as far as I'm concerned, it did exactly what we hoped it would do. And I kind of thought, all right, I've said my piece. It's for other people to come build. I wrote Jesus' Literacy and then Jesus Against the Scribal Elite. And so I felt like on these isolated issues, I gave an example of what historical Jesus research could look like without the criteria of authenticity. But I kept getting asked, okay, well, if we're getting rid of those, what are we putting in its place? And I kept kind of thinking, well, that's up to the field. I felt like my role was to criticize the criteria approach. I really, I felt like I was ground clearing, and I wasn't very interested at all in dictating what was going to come next. I thought that was for people who wanted to kind of do that work from the ground up. And so I kind of thought that I had exited stage right. And then, in conversations with James, we just kept going back and forth and realized that, well, apparently no one's going to do it. So we're in a position to do it and have opinions. And we thought we could put together a stellar team that could be a start. I'm sure that James has told you something similar, but we did not view this as like what it has to be. We viewed this as an example of what it can be and an invitation for other people to dream up other things.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. Well, real quick, before we move into what you discuss in the chapter on your book, maybe explain the criterion of authenticity to my audience, because I know that there are I've done a lot of episodes on historical Jesus research over the last couple of weeks. And some of my friends that listen to this show have been like, you need to ask these people to define terms because they don't necessarily know what they mean. So maybe just give us an example of what a criterion is in Gospels research.
Okay. The easiest way to think about criteria of authenticity is as a sieve, or maybe a funnel that you pour the gospel, literally, the gospel narratives into. All right. And then what's at the bottom of that funnel, or that sieve, that restricts what comes out the bottom would be the criteria of authenticity. This is how they function. All right. So with that kind of imagery in mind, the criteria are a loose collection of logical assertions that historical Jesus scholars have come up with really in the last 100, 150 years. Various ones of them have antecedents that, precede somebody saying this is how historical Jesus research works. But really, for about the past 100, 150 years, historical Jesus scholars have used these logical assertions to determine what in the Gospels we can take back to the historical Jesus. So one very popular one is the criterion of, let's go with the criterion of multiple attestation. The criterion of multiple attestation asserts that if something, the more independent early witnesses a particular saying or action or claim about Jesus appears in, the more likely it is to be the historical Jesus. and not just a creation of the early church. So if, for example, there's, let's say, the practice of the Lord's Supper, it's in all four of the earliest Gospels, and it's in Paul. It's in the writings of Paul. So people would say, okay, almost certainly Jesus did something like that. The more, with regards to his sayings, if it's in the Synoptics and John, or the Synoptics and Thomas, or John and Thomas, or Peter, the Gospel of Peter, the more sources you can stack up that are assumed to be independent, the stronger the case for it being the historical Jesus. The criterion, another criterion, is the criterion of embarrassment, which is the idea that if there's something that Jesus' earliest followers would not have invented, then it's more likely to be the historical Jesus. If they wouldn't have invented it because it's embarrassing, it would be embarrassing to them. So something that often passes the criterion of embarrassment is Jesus' baptism by John the Baptist. So the logic runs that early Christians wouldn't believe that Jesus was superior to John the Baptist, so they never would have invented a tradition of Jesus submitting to John the Baptist. So that often passes, and people say, "Oh, that almost certainly was the historical Jesus. It wasn't an invention of the early church." There are other ones. The criterion of dissimilarity argues that if something is unlike the Second Temple Judaism that Jesus came from, and it's unlike the early followers of Jesus that came from him, if it's different from the things that are chronologically on either side of Jesus, and so it didn't come from Judaism and Second Temple Judaism, and it didn't come from early Christianity, then it must have come from the historical Jesus. These, again, it's a collection of ideas about how the early Christians would have or would not have invented ideas about Jesus. And for years and years and years, it was the primary way that people do historical Jesus research, to the extent that, in the 90s and the early 2000s, most historical Jesus textbooks would just introduce the criteria of authenticity as saying, this is how you do it. You take the Gospels, you apply these criteria, whatever comes out at the bottom, that's historical Jesus. And you can build your image of the historical Jesus out of what's left, right?
Yeah.
So they're a way of getting behind the Gospels by sifting through the traditions. Does that help?
No, that was a perfect explanation. And your article is really going to challenge that paradigm of trying to get to the historical Jesus behind the text. And you state at the very beginning of your article that the next quest for the historical Jesus, and these are your words, must account for the inaccessibility of the past. So talk to us about that statement and how that applies to historical research generally.
Okay. Well, historical research generally, if you think about what historians do, you think they're talking about the past and what happened, right? In the case of early Christianity and historical Jesus research, the topic of conversation is usually what actually happened. They use this word actually all the time, as opposed to what the earliest followers of Jesus claimed happened, because so it goes. If we can't trust them, they probably made some stuff up. I don't have any doubt whatsoever that they did make stuff up. But the idea is we can't take the Gospels at face value. So how do we find out what actually happened? What is behind the interpretations of Jesus that we see in the Gospels? So historical Jesus research really did proceed under the idea that we could get back to something, whether it was a saying, or some historical Jesus scholars conceptualize it as getting back to Jesus himself, like getting back behind the sources. So that's my claim, is basically saying historical Jesus research has been stuck in this idea that we can get back behind the Gospels, that we can find a way to sift through them or sift beyond them. And the spatial imagery in this language is always along these lines. It's behind, it's beyond, it's through the Gospels, these types of things. And the basic claim that I make at the beginning of the article or that chapter is, we need to reckon with the fact that we can't do that. we can't do it now. We never could do it. That is not to say, Alex, we can't do historical research and we can't talk about the past and we can't know things about the past. What it is to say is we can't do it like this.
Yeah, because the idea has always been, it's almost like if you go into a house and there are walls that have been covered up by wallpaper. If you scratch away at the wallpaper, eventually you'll reveal like the tangible wall on the other side. And that's kind of been the way that people have looked at it, but that's just not the way the historical research works, right?
No, they'll use the imagery of the snowball rolling downhill. There's something there at the middle, but by the time it rolls through the centuries and picks up a little interpretation from this place and a little interpretation from that place, you get a big snowball at the bottom, and you got to find a way to kind of melt through it or peel the layers of an onion back. That's a very, very, very common image. You said you went to CCU, so I'm going to assume also, since you are the Protestant Libertarian here, I'm going to assume you grew up in a fairly conservative home.
Yeah.
When I was a kid, there was this show they showed us in church called Superbook about these two kids and their robot that went back in time to Bible stories. And of course, like everybody knows, you can't really do that. But it is astounding the amount of historical research that assumes that, like, well, of course, we're not going to time travel, but I'm capable of sifting through the Gospels and the archaeological layers of the Gospels and coming out with something that's really super early. And so yeah, we're not going back in time, and we're definitely not going with our robot, but I think I can get us back to an earlier stage. And I mean, it's what I want to say is how.
Right.
And I'm not even asking a facetious question. This idea that we really can get back to the past somehow animates the field. And I have a line there at the beginning of this chapter that points out that, like, everyone gives lip service to this. Well, of course we can't go back in time. We can't actually recreate the past, right? But we proceed to walk, talk, and act like we can. And so that's what I'm trying to kind of bluntly call out at the beginning.
Yeah, I want to talk about the history of that a little bit, because I've had a couple of my guests over the last several months. We've talked a lot about the Jesus Seminar and their approach, because I think that they kind of represent like the epitome of that approach to the Gospels, and like assigning individual words of the Gospels as being either historical, like Jesus said this word, but the word that comes after it, and it's just that way of doing it. Just if you think about it, it just doesn't make any sense. But like you said, and like you say in your article, this has been the predominant paradigm in New Testament scholarship for a very long time. And you give a couple of examples of scholars that really epitomize that approach to reading the Gospels. And of course, one of them is the great Rudolf Bultmann, and you discuss him in this chapter. And so talk to us a little bit about Rudolf Bultmann and how his methods were designed to do exactly what you were just saying we can't do.
Alex, you went to CCU?
Yeah.
All right. So we had a Gospels professor there. Very good Gospels professor.
John Weatherly.
And what did he teach his classes to do at the name of Rudolf Bultmann?
Everyone had to hiss every time he said the word.
Everyone would hiss. And I think, and it was kind of a funny thing in classes, but I really have come to think that was a serious mistake for a couple reasons.
Yeah.
Number one, it makes undergraduates think that they're actually in a position to tangle with Rudolf Bultmann and understand what he was doing and easily dismiss it. And that is a grave mistake. None of them were in a position, neither was I when I was that undergraduate, in a position to do that. Rudolf Bultmann is the greatest New Testament scholar of the 20th century, and I don't think that there's a close second. He is for certain the greatest gospel scholar. And the edifice that he built over the course of his career is something that, in many ways, my work is still trying to pick away at and dismantle. But it has survived. It has survived even when people think that it didn't. So Rudolf, I've always felt like whenever I'm critical of Bultmann that I was a kitten swiping at the tail of a tiger. And I'll also say the Jesus Seminar, I want to go back to this real quick before I answer your question. The Jesus Seminar was in many ways doing methodologically the exact same thing that Bultmann and the form critics did. Their actual method as they approached the gospel tradition was essentially form criticism, to the extent that some people think, well, these people really don't belong in the so-called third quest for the historical Jesus. But I also want to say that similar to the way that a lot of people treat Bultmann, I don't believe that we should dismiss the Jesus Seminar so quickly, because what they were doing actually made utter and complete sense if you work within their system. Yeah. Not only did it make sense, but they marketed this niche field to a public audience better than it has ever been done in the last 20 or 30 years for sure. That was a high watermark. And you have to take your hat off and tip it to Robert Funk. I mean, he was way. Imagine what the Jesus Seminar could have accomplished with social media,
right?
Because Funk was way ahead of the game, and everybody else is still trying to catch up in some ways. That doesn't mean they're right. I think they're radically wrong about almost everything that they say, but they were right about some aspects of the field, and that deserves to be said. Now, good Lord, you got me off track. What was he?
We're talking about Rudolf Bultmann and his method and how he influenced New Testament scholarship.
So Bultmann, building on the work of Martin Debelius and several others, there were 2 or 3 other precedents for this, but he really popularized his form criticism in a book called The History of the Synoptic Tradition. And what it asserted was that at the earliest stages, the transmission of the gospel tradition happened in decontextualized units. What I mean by decontextualized units is that they had not yet been joined together in the narrative structure of the gospels. So if you think about the synoptic gospels or John, there's a certain arc to the narrative. Jesus comes on the scene. He interacts with John the Baptist. He has a public ministry. There's his trial, crucifixion, appearances, aftermath. There's this common narrative arc. And the essential assertion and circular argument of form critics was that narrative was never there. That was a later imposition by slightly more educated followers of Jesus who knew about narratives and knew about order. But the earliest followers of Jesus were ruffians. They were simpletons. And they passed the Jesus tradition along in decontextualized, atomistic units, particular sayings or particular stories, maybe, or particular they did it in parables. And so essentially, we have to step back and say, this is fascinating. Not for what it was, but for what it let you do with it. Because once you chop the Gospels up into little pieces like that and say at the earliest stages, they weren't sewn together like this. They were just these bits, right? This saying, blessed are the poor in spirit. This teaching about render unto Caesar. This example of Jesus calling the disciples. Once they become these free agents that are broken free of the gospel tradition, I mean, it's like a Lego thing. Yeah, there are instructions for how they go together, but once you take it apart, you can build it back however you want. And that simple thing, breaking the Gospels down into decontextualized units that then you can build back however you want, is rocket fuel for the next several decades of gospel scholarship, because all of a sudden you can recreate whole communities that, based on isolated pieces of the tradition that for this, that, or the other reason you think are earlier or later or associated with this geographical location, or, so when you start talking about particular communities in early Christianity, the Johannine community, the Pauline community, that's undergirded by this idea that you can assign particular pieces of tradition to particular geographical locations and particular chronological locations. And I mean, you have to step back and say it's a genius way to approach things, because all of a sudden it's super creative. You can do all kinds of things with it. So, and historical Jesus scholars, eventually, it only took one generation. It was Bultmann's students. So Martin Debelius developed this. Martin Debelius said, it cannot tell us anything about history. It can't tell us about whether we can break these units up and we can reclassify them as, controversy narratives, miracle stories, parables. But it doesn't tell us anything about whether Jesus really did or didn't say something.
Right.
Bultmann came along and said, actually, it can tell us that. But he asserts this right at the very beginning. We're going to have to make these decisions. But in practice, he only ever really assigned things to earlier or later stages of the followers of Jesus. All right. Bultmann's students, Ernst Käsemann and others, turned around and said what Bultmann used to recreate the earliest stages of the tradition, we can push beyond that and use the same methods to get to the historical Jesus and give thumbs up, thumbs downs on stuff. And that's when they explicitly started developing the criteria of authenticity as the means by which they could do that. So to the people who think, I have often been criticized when I talk about the criteria of authenticity, critics will say, yeah, but nobody really thinks that they can get back to the earliest to the historical Jesus. We're just talking about the earliest stages of the tradition. And I say, no, they did think that. And that's explicitly why they developed them. It is unquestionable. And if you have repurposed it for another cause, then you need to explain how and why you're doing that, because they had a very specific intent in using them.
Yeah. Well, man, I do completely agree with you on Bultmann. I remember sitting in Weatherly's class and hissing every time he said his name. But then when I read Jesus Christ and Demythology after college, I was like, wait, a lot of what he says actually kind of makes sense. He's a very intelligent guy. And then just reading him within the context of Germany after World War II, there's a lot of stuff about his work that I really admire. And so I completely agree with you. He's not someone that we should just outright reject. But you're absolutely correct in saying that this paradigm had a profound influence on what will become the third quest. So maybe just talk about that for a minute, like even up into the 2000s and even the 2010s. How has this way of looking at the gospel shaped all New Testament scholarship?
Well, I don't have time to cover all the New Testament scholarship.
Well,
but I will
I'm sorry, the gospel studies in particular. Yeah.
The most clear and succinct way to say is anytime that historical Jesus scholars start treating what they call units of tradition, in the original writings of the form critics, they would refer to it as Stücke. Whenever they start talking about pieces, individual units of tradition, they are under the influence. They are researching under the influence of form criticism, because it is categorically form criticism that tells you that the way to approach the gospel tradition is through individual units of tradition that you can give a thumbs up, that you can apply a litmus test to, thumbs up, thumbs down. For the genealogy of it, so Bultmann and Debelius developed the forms and the theory of forms, and they didn't agree with each other on everything, but the edifice they built was largely similar. Bultmann's students, Käsemann and others, started applying the criteria of authenticity to the individual units of tradition that had been broken free from the gospel narratives, the narrative structures. And that is what's called the new quest, because Bultmann was kind of like, well, we can't know anything about this Jesus. He did think that form criticism compels us to answer historical questions, but we can't actually answer them. We can't really know anything. That's a slight. He did actually think you could know some things about the historical Jesus, but in general
it wasn't much.
You couldn't know much. All right, Käsemann then comes along. Käsemann's great break with Bultmann is that, lo and behold, the vast majority of the Gospels are ahistorical, but we can use the criteria of authenticity, and in this context, he's explicitly concerned with the criterion of dissimilarity to recover little snippets that you can say are from the historical Jesus. So Käsemann's revolution is to say that it's not all completely bunk. Yeah. We might be able to rescue a few little isolated traditions out. And that renews the quest for the historical Jesus and becomes what we call the second or the new quest for the historical Jesus, coming out of Bultmann's no quest. under that schema,
Yeah.
which is flawed. But so then the third quest comes along and doesn't really change the method at all. They still use the criteria of authenticity to give a thumbs up or a thumbs down. The main difference in the third quest is an obsession with Jesus's Judaism, Jesus being Jewish, and really an influx of Christian scholars. Really, it was the evangelical scholars, particularly North American evangelical scholars, started participating. There was a mass flood of evangelical scholars. So the third quest, and I do think these things are connected. The more popular the Jesus seminar got,
Right.
the more necessary it was, the more popular the Jesus seminar got using form criticism and the criteria of authenticity, the more necessary it was for Christian scholars and conservative scholars to rise up to meet them. And the criteria of authenticity was their means, I am utterly convinced of this, was their means of going behind enemy lines. The difference is they never used, and there is a historical Jesus scholar who teaches at Dallas Theological Seminary who's given papers saying you can't use the criteria of authenticity to disprove the historical status of any of the Gospels, but you can use it to prove it. That is the exact opposite of what Ernst Käsemann did. Ernst Käsemann said it's by and large all mythological, but we might be able to get some snippets out. And now there are conservative historical Jesus scholars who say, well, we have to treat it all as kind of neutral. We can't really rule anything out, but we can prove that some things are certain. And I always think, surely you see, we see what you're doing.
Yeah.
But that's the short genealogy, is that the criteria of authenticity renewed the quest for the historical Jesus. The third quest picked it up and amplified it. The methods didn't really change in terms of how you give a thumbs up or thumbs down to any individual unit of tradition. What changed were several other factors. And for what it's worth, to go back to your first question, the emphasis on Jesus' Judaism and Jesus being a Jewish person became equally problematic. And that really is what agitated James Crossley and a lot of his scholarship. And so our mutual dissatisfactions for different reasons about the state of historical Jesus studies kind of collided into this book.
Yeah, and just as a note for listeners, the interview that's going to come out the week before this one is with Adele Reinhardt's, also on her chapter in the book on the Jewishness of Jesus, which is fantastic, and I would recommend you go back and listen to that. So obviously, the argument that you make in your contribution and in your other published works is that these criterion just can't get us there, and you've kind of already explained why you feel that that's the case, and instead, you tend to agree with the approach that is made by New Testament scholar Dale Allison, where he says that we can't get back to exactly what happened to the perfect portrait, the video camera recording of what took place in history, but we can kind of have a general understanding of the gist of who the historical Jesus was. And another scholar who is really influential for me, James Dunn, has a very similar paradigm where he talks about the impact of Jesus. Instead of saying that this statement, this tradition is historically accurate and this one isn't, we need to look at how these contribute to the overall impact of Jesus. So talk to us about why the criterion fail, and then how Dale Allison's gist approach to the historical Jesus is superior to the form critical approach.
The criteria approach fails specifically because it's built on top of form criticism as a means of getting back beyond the interpretations, getting through disregarding the interpretations of the earliest transmitters of the Jesus tradition. They explicitly want to strip early Christian interpretation of Jesus from the tradition, and then what's left over is assumed to be uninterpreted material or an uninterpreted Jesus. And they are quite explicit that this is what they're doing. We're removing the earliest interpretations of Jesus so that we can just get back to the raw Jesus, uninterpreted. That fails specifically because the past is never packaged in an uninterpreted way. It was not then, it is not now, it will not ever be. We don't, even if you could be part of Superbook and go back in the past and experience something, you would have a perspective that is necessarily limited by your vision, your cultural context, your ability. It was amazing to me that in Superbook, looking back on it, they always spoke English
Right.
here in the ancient world. You wouldn't be able to understand it. So sometimes people say, well, historical Jesus studies, if you are carrying a camera around in the ancient world, what would you see? And I think that even doesn't give it to you, because what you would see is whatever the camera is aimed at, and you wouldn't see a whole bunch of other stuff, which could radically impact what is in the frame. So it fails because the past, and this is where my work in social memory theory dovetailed with these interests. The past is never packaged in an uninterpreted form. Quite to the contrary, the only way that the past survives into the present is specifically through our understandings of it. So, quite apart from trying to eliminate the understandings of the earliest followers of Jesus, the interpretations that they had from the process, I want to understand why they came to those, because that's the only reason that the tradition carried forward. That's what made the whole thing possible. So the very thing that everybody's been trying to eliminate from the equation is the thing that I think makes the discussion possible in the first place. Dale, I think that James Dunn is correct. The impact of Jesus and asking why he was remembered the way he was. For example, if I live in a house that's got a huge backyard and a massive fence between me and my neighbor, and I hear something that sounds like a dog barking, kids playing with a dog, sounds like a dog eating, sounds like a dog snoring, but I can never get over that fence. I can never see through it. All I can do is receive the information that I get, the sounds that make it to my ears. I might not ever know for sure whether there's a dog on the other side of that fence. I don't know whether there's a dog or a human who sounds like a dog, or someone playing a recorded dog, or a bear that just happens to sound like a dog. Right? Those are all possibilities. But I might have really good reason for assuming that whatever it is, it's not a whale. So what I'm saying is, when we look at the impact, can we get back to what it actually is or was? No, but that's not the same as not being able to know anything. The earliest followers of Jesus were convinced that he was crucified by Rome. Why might he have? Well, I think at least one really good explanation is that Rome crucified him.
Right.
Could they have made that up? Yes, they could have. Is that as good of a historical explanation as the idea that it actually happened? No. Now, that does not work for every argument. Well, or at least it doesn't work in the same way. The earliest Christians were equally convinced that he was resurrected. Does that mean that he really was resurrected? No. But we can't say we do or don't believe in resurrection and therefore he did or didn't. All we can say is they really believed it. Why might he have been?
Yeah.
Why might they believe that? Not why might he have been. Why might they have believed that? And so what we're left with is explaining. The historical task becomes explaining how they came to think the things that he did, not trying to disregard what they came to think. Explaining it. And that's very different from affirming it. We don't have to say, for example, I spent time in a book arguing that I don't think Jesus ever really did stand up and read from the scroll of Isaiah in Nazareth. I don't think he could have. But I go out of my way to explain how it is that Luke came to think that he could. And I don't think that Luke was just making it up because that's what he wanted to do. I think there are reasons that Luke and other people would have thought that about Jesus. So the historical knowledge that we gain has to kind of be gained by trying to explain what happened or what could have happened based on what we can access. I will say Dale Allison's Constructing Jesus and his other volumes leading up to it are excellent. Dale Allison has been so good to me, but I'm often accused of trying to build on him or something like that. I actually had finished writing Jesus' Literacy before his Constructing Jesus came out, so I just happened to be drinking from the same stream that he was. I did not know that he was working on it, and I cited it at the very end of the book but the manuscript had already been finished. But I kind of came to that independently of Dale. But I agree with him, and the gist is exactly right. We can't go back and give a thumbs up, thumbs down to this particular thing, that particular thing. It's just not within our ability. But we can very much try to explain. All right, well, did Jesus say this thing on this day? I don't know. But did he say things like that? That's a different type of thing.
Yeah. You're also very influenced by the work of Jen Schroeder. And I have not, I got to admit, I've not read any of his work before. So just talk to us about his approach to history and why you find it so appealing.
Well, Jens had made was the first person in my knowledge and he was working not with social memory theory, but cultural memory theory, the outgrowth of Jan and Leida Osman. But he was the first one to really articulate clearly for a reception history approach to the historical Jesus, which means that we approach the historical Jesus by understanding and his reception history, how he was received. So he too was talking about the impact of Jesus, trying to explain the impact of Jesus. And Jens too was very convinced that you could not do this isolated unit tradition approach the way that the form critics did. Jens was saying this long before he was saying this in German in 1997 when I was 17 years old. So he was doing this long before everybody else. But Jens is also the one that really started implementing postmodern historiographical approaches in historical Jesus studies that basically show that this quest for objectivity, the idea that we can be objective and really know what really happened, is an illusion. And we are only ever, the phrase that I love about Jens's work is that we're only ever in front of the text. We can't actually sift through it and get behind it. We can be in front of it and we can speculate, we can theorize, we can hypothesize about how it came to be, and we can gain historical knowledge by that. But we don't ever get past it on the other side. So my chapter is beyond what's behind. Let's get beyond the quest to get behind the text and embrace what the task of the historian really is.
And you also, and I think that this is so incredibly important too, and this is something that came up in my conversation with Adele that was on the show last week, whenever this comes out, is just the idea that there has been in New Testament scholarship this renewed interest in Jesus as a Jew. But it's almost as if when some, especially very conservative New Testament scholars, do historical analysis, they're doing so in a way that is intended to draw a particular conclusion about who Jesus has to be. And one of the points that you make in your article that I find so compelling here is that you talk about how if we're focusing on the reception history, then we also have to understand the social, political, and historical context of Jesus, because he would have had to have made sense within that cultural milieu, instead of just doing like Adele has said, taking these tidbits, I guess, of historical information and saying, well, this has to lead us to, the Orthodox Jesus and at the end of it. So talk to us a little bit about how, based on your post criteria, post trying to get behind the text approach to Jesus, how the cultural, social, and political context of Jesus fits into all this. What can this tell us about the historical Jesus?
Well, it gives you restrictions on what type of theories about the historical Jesus can count as plausible or implausible. Because Jesus had to have, I may or may not think that Jesus was crucified by Rome, but I have to explain why across the board they thought he was. And part of explaining why they thought he was, I can't make a decision about that unless I know how crucifixion works in the Roman Empire and in Judea. So to use your scholarly imagination, it has to be an informed scholarly imagination for it to count as a historical Jesus argument among your peers. So again, when you decontextualize the tradition and turn it into itty bitty bits, all of a sudden you actually remove the restrictions. You're building the historical Jesus up instead of trying to create a theory that accounts for what we actually have. I have a piece in my chapter on the title of Son of God. There are a lot of historical Jesus scholars that say, well, that's just the earliest Christians reading their theological approach onto to Jesus. So that can't be, that the historical Jesus wasn't really the Son of God. They just thought he was. So we're just going to eliminate that from the equation, and we'll just talk about, whether Jesus actually said, blessed are the poor. Right? And I think you've just abdicated your role as a historian. Whether you think Jesus was the Son of God is irrelevant. They did. And so whatever did happen, and I am interested in I am actually interested in what really happened. Whatever happened, it has to lead to their conviction and articulation of the idea that he was the Son of God. And I run through a gamut of possible explanations for that, and say, we can explain it in any number of ways. But we have to explain why they came to think what they did, not just take that off the table because we disagree with it. So the general context becomes really, really important for our ability to understand what they're even claiming in the first place. I don't know if you grew up in the church like I did. I heard forever that the title Son of Man refers to Jesus' humanity, and the title Son of God refers to Jesus' divinity. Well, even an undergraduate student in the Gospels finds out that's not the case. If anything, it's probably the opposite. But that's not the case. So how can I make a historical decision about what the earliest followers of Jesus meant by calling him, or how can I make a decision about how and why the earliest followers of Jesus came to use those titles for him if I don't understand what those titles actually mean when they're saying them? So boring old historical work about text and history and socio-historical context and literary criticism and all that stuff becomes the tools by which you use your historical imagination. And I should also say, I don't think that we get real good explanations historically about everything. Sometimes we just need to throw our hands up and say, I don't have any idea.
Yeah. When I want to talk to you for just a minute about the significance of the word humility and the word imagination, because you use both of them and talk about how significant they are. And for me, I mean, I don't know if your experience in college was similar to mine, but I know that when I started as a freshman, I was like, oh, I have so much to learn about Jesus. And then there was a time around my junior and senior year, I was like, man, I'm really starting to get this stuff figured out. And then by the time I graduated, I realized I had no idea what I was talking about. And I still kind of feel that way. And so it's really important to have humility when you're approaching the historical Jesus. And you also talk about the role of imaginative interpretation, that it's not as cut and dry as a lot of Christians would wish that it could be. So talk to us about the significance of humility and imagination and trying to reconstruct the historical Jesus.
I think humility is the appropriate response to the sea of ignorance that we swim in. There's just so much stuff that we don't know. And, I have an undergrad degree and 2 master's degrees and a PhD, and spent a lot of time researching this stuff. And one of the things I came to the rather firm conclusion about was that, I know a lot about a tiny, tiny, tiny little sliver. And I don't know a lot about everything else. And that's necessarily what happens when you get a PhD, but when I have PhD students, one of the most important stages that you go through is, you've come through a master's degree, and it's a similar process to what you were talking about. By the time you get through a master's degree and you've had a 4.0, everybody's telling you how brilliant you are, and you get accepted to a PhD program. Everybody thinks you're a genius and you know everything. All that's really happened is you think the field is this big, and you've got it 3/4 of the way covered. You're going to go top up this other 25% at the PhD, and then you'll know everything. And one of the first things you figure out as a PhD student is you thought the field was this big, and you knew 75% of it, but actually it's 800 times what you thought it was, and you only know about 0.008% of anything. So, and I think the appropriate response to that is just to embrace it. Man, I mean, we get to learn this stuff. We get to learn this stuff and spend time studying it, and that's a privilege. So when it comes to the ancient world, it's just that inclination applied to our research. There's an approach in scholarship that the more convinced you are, the more vocal you are, the more accepted your idea will be. If I just scream it enough times at a high enough volume, I'll eventually, get the attention that I deserve. Because everybody else, they're all idiots and they just haven't seen this brilliant theory that I've been working on. So if I will just lay it out in front of them, they'll understand that I'm right. And then when they get rejected, oh, I'm sorry, I must need to turn the volume up. You didn't hear it correctly. All right. And I think, no, I don't have that approach to scholarship. I think that the more interesting thing is to say, I'm pretty confident about what I've spent time on, and there's a lot that I'm still learning. And there's a certain amount of humility that we need to have in faith communities. Saying I don't know is often treated as a negative or a weakness. And I think that's incorrect. I had one professor who if you wanted answers, they give you answers. They had an answer for every question you ever had, because saying that they didn't know somehow in their minds made them weak or something. And I think, well, hang on. For those of you who are in faith communities, you're talking about God, right? Don't you think it would be appropriate to say, I don't know? And even further, if you're just talking about history, of course, there's all kinds of. Well, I don't know what's going on in my own house with my kids half the time. How can I possibly know what happened at this Passover on at this time in this location with extreme confidence? Yes, I know the Gospels say that this, that, and the other thing happened, and I need to be clear about the nature of that claim. It's a claim. And the fact that people take that text as scripture doesn't make it any less of a claim. It just means that they're inclined to accept the claim. But it's still a claim, and as historians, what we're doing is investigating the value of that claim. And it's not an all or nothing game. It's not, that either happened or it didn't. No, and there are some things I'm really convinced that Jesus was crucified by the Romans. There's a lot of things that the Gospels claim about Jesus that there's some of them I have no idea. There's some of them I'm really convinced didn't happen. I think we need to embrace that spectrum of possibilities, because it reflects our incomplete knowledge of antiquity and of everything else. The imagination. I think that we are always, this builds on that idea. We are always theorizing and formulating our ideas about the past by taking what we do know and trying to account for what we don't know. Because we don't get complete pictures, we just get little snippets. So we're always necessarily having to include what we don't know in order to form a story about what we do know and provide a bigger picture. And we use our imaginations to do that. And so what I want is to have a informed and trained imagination. And so the more I can know about antiquity of the text, the earliest followers of Jesus, the more informed my scholarly imagination can be. But make no mistake about it, the fact that it's scholarly informed doesn't make it any less of an imagination.
Yeah. Well, I guess this is something that I've kind of struggled with too, because I do go to a more traditional church. And I guess in terms of like my faith and practice, I'm kind of a traditional guy when it comes to a lot of that stuff. But I completely agree with your hermeneutical approach to the Gospels and to history. I think that's just the way that things are. How would you approach somebody who would especially maybe someone coming out of a Christian tradition who really wants to hold on to the idea that there is bedrock historical information in the Gospels. It's just simply a matter of saying, like, we can't do it. Sorry, like, you can believe it if you want, but it's just not the way that reality works. Or how would you approach somebody like that who holds on to that, maybe even for like theological reasons instead of historical ones?
I would ask them what they're going to do with that bedrock. More importantly, what are you going to do with everything that's not bedrock? Where does that actually get you? Now there are plenty of people who go down this path and, walk away from faith communities altogether. But there are also a lot of people who manage to remain in faith communities. I mean, some of the most liberal Jesus scholars that you've ever read were actually pretty faithful church people. So there are people who manage to keep it together. If I'm being completely honest, what I would say is that your faith is probably in the wrong thing. We don't believe in historical bedrock. On my better days, I would probably still call myself a Christian. We don't believe in historical bedrock. Historical bedrock was never the center of the faith anyway. And what does Paul say? We know now in part, we'll know then in full. The earliest followers of Jesus had no problem embracing the idea that they don't know everything. That it was actually quite part and parcel to just life itself, that you just don't know everything. The people I know that would take that approach, and the people that get really, really angry when you take Jesus away from them, my inclination is to say that you might want to think very hard about what your conviction is in and the nature of. Look, to be honest with you, Alex, I don't think that this is any different than when a believer comes face to face with cancer.
Yeah.
All of a sudden, it rocks the way that you approach the whole thing. Or any other type of tragedy, something happens to someone's kids or a family member that's an utter and complete tragedy, and they're trying to figure out, look, there are people that crashes their faith, and there are people that manage to keep it together. It never remains unchanged, but that's the case anyway. So, if I were talking to these people, and there's no reason to make it hypothetical, I talk to them a lot, or at least I used to. I would say that I think that maybe your blessed assurance is a little misplaced. I don't know that it ever should have been there in the first place.
Yeah, I actually really appreciate that answer, and I definitely agree with you. Well, I got one final question for you today. You've done such a great job of explaining the chapter in the book.
Alex, let me interrupt you real quick.
Oh, yeah.
I can hear people saying, well, yeah, but if you conclude that Jesus never lived or something, that's obviously going to change your faith. To that, I would say, yes. Yeah, that much is true. I'm not saying that history doesn't matter, because the quintessential Christian claim of the earliest centuries was that God became a man in space and time. The ones that thought that he only appeared to be were regarded eventually as heretics. So the historical nature of the earliest Christians' claims about Jesus' identity, they're there. My point is not that it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter at all. It's that it doesn't matter at all.
Right.
It's not. It's not all or nothing. So.
That's a great way of putting it. And I really appreciate that. The last question that I want to ask you is a question that is really impossible to answer because you can't predict the future. But I know that the next quest is kind of a concerted effort to at least move the conversation about the historical Jesus forward, to push it to places that it hasn't yet gone. And so when you're looking at the field of Jesus research 20, 30, 40 years down the road, based on what's happening right now, where do you think it's going to be?
I really don't know. I don't know what it'll look like in 5 years. I think that James and I both had the opinion that we thought things had to change, and we had some ideas about how they could change. But I mean, we reckoned early on with the idea that, these might be picked up and these might be rejected. it might fall flat. I don't think it will. I think we put a team together that did an excellent job and will give us some juice into the future. But it really is going to be to other people to pick up and run with that. So I think that there'll have to be some innovative approaches. I think, James talks a lot about archived material. I think that there's a lot in Jesus' socio-historical context that can inform historical Jesus studies that has not been pursued to the extent that it can. We talk about, there's a chapter on slavery. We know that's a hot topic with antiquity. And I think there's a lot to be done there. I really think boring old studies like what's going on in the Galilean economy, what was the relationship, there's a chapter on the relationship between Jerusalem and Galilee. Man, there's a lot of work that could be done on that has a direct implication. Jesus' travel itinerary between Galilee and Jerusalem is treated differently in each gospel, but it's crucial for each gospel. It's building upon common assumptions about what it was like at that point in time to be in Jerusalem and Galilee. There's a whole lot of work that could be done there. So I personally would love to see a return to more boring old socio-historical context work that's just been neglected. But I also think there's going to be a lot of work to be done in reception history and the history of interpretation as well. So, James and I would agree very much so on those points.
That's perfect. Well, Dr. Chris Keith, it's been a lot of fun talking with you today. Before I let you go, where can people find your work, follow you, all of those things?
It's on Amazon. I'm not on Twitter anymore, so I'm on Threads and I'm on Blue Sky. But you could find me there if you look hard enough.
All right, perfect. Well, Chris Keith, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Yeah, thank you, Alex, for having me.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. If you have any questions or comments, please reach out to me at theprotestantlibertarian@gmail.com. You can also find me on Twitter. You can follow me at the handle @ProLibertyPod. Again, that is @ProLibertyPod. And you can also visit me at theprotestantlibertarianpodcast.com. At theprotestantlibertarianpodcast.com, you can also support the Christians for Liberty Network and the Libertarian Christian Institute. Thank you guys so much for listening to this episode, and we will see you next Tuesday.